Julie Sue looked into the camera and said it with confidence. "We're helping workers." It sounded polished, rehearsed, almost presidential. But then Senator John Kennedy, seated just 3 chairs down, opened a folder, flipped on a page, and calmly began reading. One number, then another, then the dates, then the names of the companies. And by the time he finished, the room wasn't applauding, it wasn't debating, it was silent, like subscribe and drop your city, because when Kennedy speaks in numbers, the spin falls apart fast. The room was packed, not just with senators, but with aides, cameras, union reps, and job advocates, all watching as Acting Labor Secretary Julie Sue took her seat at the center of the witness table. The hearing was billed as a routine check-in on Department of Labor priorities, but everyone knew it wasn't routine. Behind the cameras, unemployment numbers had ticked upward in 5 states, including Louisiana. Several large companies had announced mass layoffs, and yet, as Julie Sue adjusted her microphone and cleared her throat, she smiled. Not the nervous kind, the confident kind. "Thank you, Chairwoman. I want to begin by saying this administration remains fully committed to uplifting America's workers. In fact, we're helping workers more than ever before." The sentence was designed for headlines, a tight quote that could sit neatly in a chyron, a tweet, or a White House press release. And for a moment it landed. A few staffers behind her nodded, a couple of attendees even clapped. But Senator John Kennedy? He didn't move. He sat third from the right, glasses low on his nose, flipping slowly through a stack of papers bound in a plain blue folder. He waited. He didn't interrupt. He didn't shift. He just read, patiently, as Sue continued her opening remarks. "We've implemented protections for gig workers, we've expanded overtime eligibility, and we've focused on closing the racial and gender wage gaps that still plague many sectors of our economy." Another applause line, another ripple of polite nods. Still Kennedy waited. His hand paused on a page near the back of the folder. Julie Sue, sensing the momentum, drove her point home. "We are proud to say we're building an economy that works for everyone." That's when Kennedy looked up. "Madam Secretary," he said, his drawl dry but precise, "before we go too far into the celebration, I'd like to ask about a few names, a few numbers, a few places." Sue blinked, not nervously but noticeably. She wasn't expecting him to speak so soon. "Of course, Senator." "Excellent," he said, calmly reaching for the page he'd marked. "Let's talk about workers, because I agree, they deserve help, but they also deserve honesty." There it was, the shift. Julie Sue had rehearsed applause lines, but Kennedy had brought something sharper. He had brought receipts, and in less than 30 seconds, he was going to start reading. Senator Kennedy adjusted the microphone slightly, not to amplify his voice, but to control the silence. Then he glanced at the page in front of him. "Madam Secretary," he began, "are you familiar with a company called Tricor Systems?" Julie Sue sat up straighter. "Yes, I believe they're in the tech sector." "They were," Kennedy replied. "Last month they laid off 870 workers. Headquarters in Nevada, operations in Texas, New Mexico, and Colorado." A pause. "Now that's not a crime. Companies downsize. Markets shift. But those workers, they went home with severance checks and watched your department release a statement saying, and I quote, 'This month's job data confirms continued labor strength.'" He didn't raise his voice. He just flipped to the next page. "How about Regency Auto Parts? Shut down its South Carolina plant. That's another 600 jobs gone." Julie Sue nodded slowly. "We're aware of those closures. Are you also aware that your office used the term transitional opportunity zone in the same report announcing the layoffs?" "Senator, do you know what that means to a guy who's been wrenching engines for 20 years? "Nothing. It means nothing." Kennedy turned the page again. The stack was deep, each line typed, each layoff documented with date, company, location, and total employees affected. Kelson Foods, 1,200 jobs, gone. Vironet Healthcare, 1,100 layoffs across 5 states. Lafferty Steel, 680 positions eliminated. Want me to keep going? Julie Sue held her hands calmly on the desk. but her eyes flicked toward a staffer behind the committee bench. Senator, with respect, layoffs are a natural part of economic realignment. Kennedy raised his hand slightly, not in anger, in containment. I'm not blaming you for every job lost. I'm not blaming you for market contractions. I'm blaming you for one thing. He tapped the page, the denial. The room quieted. Kennedy leaned in. You tell us you're helping workers. But if helping workers means using corporate wellness jargon while they're packing boxes in the dark, then what you're really helping is the headline, not the human. No one clapped. No one moved. Kennedy looked down one last time. These aren't just numbers. They're people. You say we're helping. I say, prove it. Julie Sue opened her mouth, but this time she didn't speak, because the applause lines were gone. And Kennedy, he hadn't come to argue. He came to read what everyone else ignored. Julie Sue took a measured breath, the kind trained professionals use when the room isn't on their side. Senator Kennedy, she said evenly, we acknowledge there are pockets of economic hardship, but the overall trajectory is clear. We're seeing historic progress, especially in workforce participation among women and communities of color. That line was familiar. It had been said at press briefings, in op-eds, on morning talk shows. Historic progress. But Kennedy wasn't buying it. He didn't roll his eyes. He didn't scoff. He simply turned the page, this time to a laminated chart. I'm going to ask you about one of those pockets of hardship, Madam Secretary. He held up the sheet. The chart was color-coded, with numbers from the Bureau of Labor Statistics overlaid with a red circle. This here's Aviel's Parish, Louisiana. Unemployment there is 9.4%. That's double the national average. Sue didn't interrupt. Now let's add East Carroll Parish, 10.3%. Then Tensas, Madison, St. Helena, all above 9%. He looked back up. These aren't zip codes. They're counties full of working-class folks who don't give a damn about national averages because they're too busy trying to afford eggs and gas. Sue responded softly. We're working on localized grant programs. Kennedy raised an eyebrow. Oh, I've seen the grants. Know what they funded in East Carroll Parish last quarter? What? He flipped again. $31,000 for a rural equity mapping project and $22,000 for a seminar on navigating career transitions in post-carbon economies. He held up the paper. You think a man in waterproof, Louisiana, who just lost his job at the grain elevator, gives a damn about a seminar with words like post-carbon economy in it? The crowd behind the witness table didn't move. Kennedy wasn't yelling, he was translating. You've built an ecosystem of elegant language, but when boots hit the ground, folks hear crickets. Sue blinked, then recovered. Senator, we're investing long-term. Ma'am, they're starving short-term. The silence returned, not from confrontation, but because the room knew exactly what had just landed. Kennedy leaned back in his chair. You call it historic progress. I call it invisible, to the people who need it most. And with that, he folded the chart in half, slid it back into his folder, and said nothing more. Julie Sue didn't argue, because for the first time in the hearing, the story wasn't hers. It was Louisiana's. Julie Sue shifted tactics. Her staff behind her had already begun messaging, typing notes, likely queuing data or preparing statements. She leaned in, trying to recalibrate the tone. Senator, with all due respect, we're aware of these pain points, but we're focused on resilient workforce transitions, not just short-term statistics. Kennedy froze for a second, mid-page turn. What did you call it? Resilient workforce transitions, she repeated. He blinked once, then closed the folder in front of him. No need for pages now. Madam Secretary, he said, do you know what resilient workforce transition looks like in St. Landry Parish? She hesitated. I don't have the specifics in front of me. Kennedy raised his finger slightly, not to accuse, but to signal patience. That's fine, I do. He reached into the side of his chair and pulled a folded letter from his jacket. This is a handwritten note from a 42-year-old machinist laid off from Melrose Forge Works. That's a small manufacturer outside Opelousas. He read aloud. Senator Kennedy, we were told the layoffs were temporary. I'm now 18 weeks without work. I tried to register for a retraining seminar funded by the new grant program, but the website said registration was closed. I called the number. No answer. Sue adjusted her posture, crossing her hands tightly. We've experienced platform delays, but I called the company. That landed. 2 days ago, I called Melrose. I asked their HR director why they hadn't rehired. You know what she told me? Sue didn't reply. She said, and I quote, "We couldn't get the loan approved because the labor department reclassified our profile as high risk for attrition support." He let that hang. You rebranded them out of assistance. You told them, through a federal proxy, they're not resilient enough to be transitioned. Sue opened her mouth, then paused. I wasn't personally involved in that decision, but you're personally repeating the phrase. A few low murmurs stirred in the chamber. Kennedy continued, Madam Secretary, these terms, transition framework, employment resiliency models, equity pipeline mapping, they don't mean anything to a man with an overdue power bill and no job. He leaned forward. You're speaking policy. I'm reading pain. Another silence. Not because he'd won an argument, because he'd ended one. Julie Sue looked down at her notes, the kind prepped for television. But Kennedy had done something else entirely. He'd gone off script. He'd made the phone call she didn't. The rhythm of the hearing had changed. Julie Sue still had prepared answers. She still had data and policy points. But now, every time she reached for one, she was met with something she didn't expect. Kennedy didn't want generalities. He wanted names, calls, documents, paper. And this time he skipped the next witness testimony entirely. The one scheduled to bridge the panel with prepared remarks about tech sector apprenticeships. Madam Secretary, Kennedy said as the witness behind her took a breath, we'll return to the panel in a moment. I just need to clarify one budget line. Sue blinked. Of course. Last quarter's disbursement summary, under Emerging Workforce Uplift Programming, there's a $5.2 million allocation for something called narrative shaping initiatives. Can you explain that? She froze. Aides shuffled behind her. One leaned in, but Kennedy raised his hand. Let her answer. Sue glanced at her notes. Yes, Senator. That line funds communications outreach, storytelling projects that aim to reframe worker experiences through a modern lens. Kennedy leaned back. Storytelling. Yes, video content, influencer partnerships, awareness campaigns about the changing identity of work. He raised a brow. So instead of reopening offices, we're making Instagram videos about unemployment? Silence. You spent $5 million, not on jobs, but on explaining away the lack of jobs. Sue stayed still. Is that what this has become? A PR exercise? Madam Secretary, I don't care how many platforms you pay. If the person watching from their couch doesn't have a gun, they're not looking for a story. They're looking for a check. Sue opened her folder and began flipping, likely trying to find something that could reframe the moment. But it was already gone. Kennedy had pierced the veil. We've become a nation that congratulates itself on describing problems well, while solving fewer of them. He tapped the paper gently. If narrative shaping gets more money than reopening a training center in Baton Rouge, you're not building an economy. You're writing a fable. Sue didn't speak. She didn't need to. The room already knew, because in that moment, the metaphor was dead, and the math was loud. Julie Sue shifted uncomfortably in her seat. Her posture was still composed, but something in her expression had changed. Not panic, not defiance, just the quiet tension of someone realizing the room wasn't with her anymore. Kennedy hadn't grandstanded. He hadn't raised his voice. He had simply anticipated something before it hit the headlines. Madam Secretary, he said quietly, last week I asked your office about early warning signs for the aviation parts industry. I received no formal response. Sue looked up. We had staff reviewing sector-wide resilience metrics. Right, Kennedy cut in. While your staff reviewed metrics, 480 workers at Delta Aerocast got a surprise envelope on a Tuesday morning. He paused. A layoff, with no warning, no reskilling pathway, just a QR code to explore next steps. He held up a printed version of the QR notice. It was blown up, on plain cardstock, black and white. This is how you told them they'd been restructured. Sue's voice lowered. We're investigating the timeline. The employer may have violated protocol. So we're playing blame ping pong while 480 people are now unemployed? Silence. Then Kennedy reached into his folder again, one final time, and pulled out a wrinkled email printout. This was forwarded to my office 3 days ago by a former Delta Aerocast line manager. It's from a workforce engagement contractor your office funded last year. He read it aloud. We are reframing job transition anxiety as a journey of self-redefinition. Encourage workers to think of layoffs as catalysts, not setbacks. Kennedy looked around the chamber. These people don't need catalysts. They need paychecks. Then slowly, almost too quietly to catch. They don't want to redefine themselves. They want to feed their kids. Sue said nothing. The rest of the panel wasn't breathing. And Kennedy? He set the email down gently and leaned back. We asked for numbers. You gave us slogans. We asked for bots. You gave us journeys. Another pause. I can't fix that from here, but I'll make sure every one of those 480 workers knows exactly who forgot them. Julie Sue didn't respond because for the first time in the hearing, it was no longer about her performance. It was about her memory, and Kennedy had just shown the country who actually kept the receipts. The hearing wrapped without fanfare. No standing ovation, no dramatic exits, just one final procedural statement from the chair and a low hum as staffers began collecting papers. Julie Sue didn't say another word. She reached for her water, glanced at her aides, and offered a faint smile, the kind you flash when there's nothing else left to do. But across the dais, Senator John Kennedy was still seated, calm, unmoved, watching. He didn't rush to the cameras. He didn't huddle with media. Instead, he slid his papers back into the blue folder, the same one he'd opened when Sue said, "We're helping workers." The session was over, but the story wasn't, because Kennedy knew, and everyone in the room knew, that it wasn't his delivery people would remember. It was his discipline, the binder, the calls, the towns, the names, and the one line he didn't have to repeat. That line wasn't designed for headlines. It wasn't slick. It wasn't rehearsed. It wasn't shouted. But it landed harder than anything else that day. You're speaking policy. I'm reading pain. It was replayed thousands of times across the internet, from independent news blogs to mainstream highlight reels. Young aides quoted it on X. Laid-off workers screen captured it and posted under #forgotten labor. And somewhere in Opelousas, the same town where Kennedy had spoken of the machinist with the unanswered call, a local talk radio station opened its segment with that very quote. You're speaking policy, I'm reading pain. Julie Sue was never scolded, never yelled at, never publicly humiliated. But she was quieted by data, by voices she didn't cite, by corners of the country her programs hadn't reached, and by a senator who didn't bring outrage. He brought records. The kind that can't be reshaped by PR or reworded by press teams. Because Kennedy hadn't come to debate. He came to document. If one line can cut through every talking point in Washington, drop a comment with your favorite Kennedy quote, hit that like button, and subscribe for more stories where the facts speak louder than the framing.